Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Good evening, everyone. Okay, we've been studying Sutta number 12 in the Majjhima Nikaya. This is the Mahāsīhanāda Sutta, the greater discourse on the lion's roar. And one question that came up last week that I just want to clarify, and this is the question, it refers to something on page 169. The Buddha speaks about the 4 different types of generation, 4 different types of birth, and then he speaks about spontaneous generation, spontaneous birth, birth without parents. And one of these types of spontaneous birth, one of the types of beings that are spontaneously born are human beings, some human beings. And so the question came up, what kind of human beings are spontaneously born? And thanks to Eva, she gave me some indication of this based on explanation of Master Yinchen. In one of his books, he gave an explanation of the 4 classes of birth, 4 types of generation. And he referred to a passage that occurs in a sutta in the Pali Digha Nikaya. In other collections also will have this type of explanation. In the Digha Nikaya, it's in the Aganya Sutta. This is in the 3rd part of the Digha Nikaya. I think it's sutta number 29 or 30. Here the Buddha says that at the beginning of the world's cycle, it also comes in the Brahmajala Sutta, I believe. Yeah, in the Brahmajala Sutta, at the beginning of any world cycle, when the world system starts to form, starts to take shape again, then those who have been human beings were previously reborn in the what's called the Abhasara Deva Loka. This is a kind of higher realm of existence where they exist as beings of light. Then when they start to appear again into the human realm, they don't appear as ordinary human beings, but they come as beings of light. They come as spontaneously born beings, not through parental birth. They're not born through sexual intercourse, but they come in through they're born here spontaneously. They have very luminous bodies. They can move about through their own will. They don't depend on other means of locomotion, but they can move about through their own will over vast distances. They're very joyful, almost like divine beings. And then gradually they become tempted by various desires to eat substances that form on the earth. And then as they eat these substances that appear, their bodies become heavier and denser. As the bodies become heavier and denser, then sexual characteristics, sexual differentiation takes place, and then sexual desire arises. And then through sexual desire and sexual union, then ordinary biological birth through the womb starts to occur. And then the spontaneous generation comes to an end, and ordinary womb birth generation occurs. Okay, so now, last time, we dealt with the Buddha's ability to determine where a being will be reborn by looking at this being and encompassing with his own mind the mind of that being. The Buddha is able to understand from that person's behavior, from that person's actions, state of mind. He's able to determine this person is behaving in such and such a way, has such and such states of mind, that if he were to pass away on this occasion, he would be reborn. It could be in the hell realm, could be in the state of the pretas, could be in the animal realm, the human realm, the heavenly realm. And if he's practicing the noble path, he'll determine that this one is going to attain liberation in this very life with no more rebirth. Okay, now the Buddha is giving this disclosure of his own superior knowledges, if you remember the original story, because of the renegade monk named Tathāgata, who had lost trust in the Buddha, lost confidence, and was going about denouncing the Buddha in the city of Vesali. And Tathāgata had set up 2 criteria for what he considered the ideal guru, ideal spiritual teacher. One is miraculous powers, superhuman powers, and he didn't see the Buddha exhibiting these superhuman powers. And the other criterion that he had set up was that the real enlightened master has to be one who practices extreme austerities. He would, even though he was a Buddhist monk, but he would look around, he would see some of the other teachers going around naked, their bodies very, very thin, just like, almost like skeletons. With maybe long hair, long beards, fierce, wild expressions in their faces. Then he would look at the Buddha, who was quite well built, who would go on alms rounds, sometimes collect quite sumptuous meals in his bowl, accept invitations to houses for meals. And he would think, how can this Buddha be a really enlightened one if he's not practicing the real ascetic path the way these other teachers are practicing? And so now the Buddha, in this section of the sutta, is going to explain the types of austerities that he had practiced previously when he was still a bodhisattva, one who was not yet an enlightened one, but still seeking the way to enlightenment. And so he's going to speak about the type of austere life that he practiced under 4 headings. He distinguishes this ascetic practice under 4, describes it from 4 different angles. He uses terms that must have been, each term would have had its own distinct meaning in the ascetic culture of India of that period. Here it's translated, one is translated as ascetic. The word is tapasi, one who practiced tapas. Tapas means really not just asceticism, but self-mortification. The idea behind this tapas is that one afflicts pain and hardship upon oneself in order to build up spiritual power within oneself. And then that spiritual power that builds up within oneself is supposed to enable one to perform extraordinary feats, so that the tapasis of the Brahminic literature were said that when one has this spiritual power, one could stop the sun from moving across the sky, one could fly through the sky, one could ascend to the mountaintop, one can cause rainstorms. When it's extremely cold, one could make the weather hot. When it's very hot, one could turn the weather cold. So one gains all of these extraordinary powers through the practice of tapas. Okay, so now the Buddha is going to describe some of the types of ascetic practices he undertook. I'll explain each term as we come across the section. Okay, so just like some of the other teachers, the Buddha says that he went naked. He would lick his hands, I guess when eating, he would just take the food up and lick the food off his hands. When people would invite him to come to take food, he would not stop to receive the food. And when they would ask him to stop, then he would not stop. And when people would bring food to him, when he would go to his resting place, if they would bring food, he would not accept it. He'll only accept what he receives on alms round. And he would never accept an invitation to go to a house for a meal. He'll take only what he receives on alms round. Some of these, I have to say, I don't quite understand the significance. He says, I would receive nothing from a pot, from a bowl, from across a threshold, across a stick, across the pestle, from two eating together, nothing from a pregnant woman, from a woman nursing a child. The next one, I think, was not rightly translated. From a woman lying in the midst of men. Literally, it's from a woman who has gone to the midst of men. I guess if there's a woman standing together with men, he would not accept anything from her. Sometimes in India, they would set up food distribution places to make offerings to ascetics. Very generous people would set up pots of food and invite the ascetics to come to receive the offerings. In that case, he wouldn't go there. He'd only accept from houses. And if he sees a dog waiting for food, he wouldn't receive it. Let the food go to the dog. Or if there are flies buzzing around, he wouldn't take the food. Let the food go to the flies. He wouldn't accept any fish or meat. And certainly he wouldn't drink any liquor or wine. Well, even after he became the Buddha, he wouldn't drink liquor or wine or fermented drinks. Then what was a common practice is to make special vows, special determinations. One determination is to only go to one house. One would receive whatever one receives at one house. One accepts and doesn't go to any other house. Sometimes to 2 houses, 7 houses. Another way is to make the determination in terms of quantities of food. 1 saucerful or 2 saucerfuls, up to 7 saucerfuls. Sometimes one makes the determination to take food for a certain number of days. Okay, taking food once a day, this is the practice that the Buddha himself observed after his enlightenment. But when engaged in the ascetic practices, he would make a determination to take food once every 2 days, once every 3 days, once every 7 days, once every fortnight. That's every 2 weeks he would take food. Then he would make determination to eat only special types of food, to eat greens or millet, wild rice, and so on. Then for a period, he wouldn't even go begging on alms round, but he would just stay in the forest, eating roots and fallen fruits, fruits that would fall from the trees. Then he observed special practices with regard to clothing. He would wear cloth, his robes would be made from hemp, or he would wear shrouds, clothes made from tree bark or antelope hide, and so on. Then he would observe some of the real, very painful ascetic practices. Instead of shaving off the hair and beard, pulling the hairs out. Very painful. Then there was some of the other painful ascetic practices that were observed by the yogis in the time of the Buddha and still today in the foothills of the Himalayas. One can find the yogis practicing this. Standing continuously, not sitting down. There are yogis, even in recent times, who make this determination not to sit down, but only to stand for months on end. Or to squat continuously, to squat down, like if you ever see the way a bird's, when it lands on the electric wires, the way it squats there. And so he would maintain the squatting position, so it's quite painful if one remains in it for a long time. Okay, then to create pain when sleeping, he would make himself a nice comfortable mattress of spikes, using thorns for the mattress, so that he would have pain, discomfort during the night. So he could not really fall into any deep sleep, but continuously he'll be pricked by these spikes and thorns. Then he would observe this practice of bathing, frequent bathing. This was a Brahminic practice. Okay, so this was the way he observed this practice of tormenting and mortifying the body. The next practice, it's called in Pali Luka, which means coarseness or rough practice. Call it, maybe you could also call it a kind of dirty practice. During the ascetic period, he would do frequent bathing, but now he would not do any bathing at all, but he would just let the dirt and dust and sweat accumulate on his body till all of that dirt and dust, and northern India is quite a dirty and dusty land. During the hot season, when there's no rain, there's so much dirt and dust. Then during the rainy season, then there's a lot of mud, and all of that accumulates on the body, and it builds up and it forms a kind of cake. And this would layers of this dirt and dust would accumulate on his body till it would just flake off. And sometimes he would rub his body with his hand, and just flakes of this dirt and dust would come off. No, he says, it would never occur to me that he would rub the dirt and dust off with his hands. But sometimes he might just accidentally touch his body with his hand, and just the dirt and dust would just break off from the body. It would be so thick. Okay, the third aspect of his ascetic practice was what he calls scrupulousness. It's called in Pali Jaiguchi, which means being extremely guarded, extremely careful. Here it's translated scrupulousness. So he says, I was extremely mindful, very careful when going forward and stepping backwards. And he said he had this pity set up within himself, even towards a drop of water, afraid to let a drop of water fall to the ground from fear that it might injure tiny creatures on the ground. Then for periods he would observe extreme seclusion. This is called paviveka, trying to avoid all contact with other human beings. So he says he would plunge into the forest and stay there. And if he saw a cowherd or a shepherd or somebody coming to collect grass or sticks, or a woodsman coming to chop down some wood, then he would run away, because he didn't want to be seen by other human beings. Then he mentions some other aspect of his practice. It seems like this is another aspect of the coarse practice or the disgusting practice. This is in paragraph 49. I hope you're not too sensitive. He would walk on all fours to the cow pens when the cattle had gone out, and then he would feed on the dung of the young calves. And he would even feed on his own excrement and urine. He calls this his great distortion in feeding. Another practice that he undertook was to deliberately expose himself to frightening situations. And this was a kind of test of the strength of his mind. And in India in this time, it's not like our modern skeptical age, but there was a belief that these very remote, secluded places were haunted by demons and spirits and ghosts and goblins, which would attack yogis and meditators who are not properly qualified and drive them insane, or even kill them and devour them alive. And so he would deliberately go to these places on those nights that were considered the inauspicious nights, the nights when it was believed that the goblins and the demons would come out and gather. And he would expose himself to them, almost taunting them and challenging them to come out and get him. And so he would go to these remote groves and stay there. And if you remember in the other sutta that we read very early in this course, this is sutta number 4, it's page 104, paragraph 20. He said that on the especially auspicious, or you could say inauspicious nights of the 14th, 15th, and 8th of the fortnight, he would go to these horrifying abodes, these remote shrines, and he would wait for what he calls the fear and dread to come. And if he was in one particular posture, for example, if he was sitting, he would remain sitting until the fear and dread that had overcome him was subdued. He would not stand up, not walk away, but he would remain sitting. If he was walking, he would continue to walk until the fear and dread that had overcome him had been dissipated. If he was standing still, he would continue to stand still until he had conquered that fear and dread. Okay, and then he would expose himself to extremes of the weather. So during the hot season, he would go out in the middle of the day. I think he would practice this, a yogic practice, an ascetic practice called the fivefold fire, which means that in the middle of the day, one sets up 4 fires around one, the fire at each of the cardinal directions, and the 5th fire is the sun directly overhead. And this is in the hot season, and in India, it's hot season, it's very hot. 110, could be 110 degrees. And so one then exposes oneself to the 4 fires on each side of oneself, and the sun directly overhead, and one endures that terrible heat without any inner complaining, without any impatience. And then during the cold season, and in northern India during December, let's say early January, it can get pretty cold. There's a period which is called the 8 days. Yeah, it's called Himapata Samaya. It's the time of Antaratake Himapata Samaya, the 8 days time of the snowfall. Here it's translated the 8 days interval of frost. So it's a period of about 8 days that occurs usually in middle of January, early January, in northern India, where it gets very cold. And so in that time he would go out stark naked and expose his body to the very cold night. And then while he was doing this verse occurred to him: chilled by night and scourged by day, alone in awe-inspiring groves, naked, no fire to sit beside, the sage yet pursues his quest. Okay, then, again, to subject himself to more hardship, he would go at night to sleep in the charnel ground. The charnel ground is not like our cemetery where the dead body is very safely buried deep beneath the ground. But in ancient India, in the charnel ground, they would take the dead bodies and usually they would cremate them, and so there would be the ashes of the dead body and the bones. And so he would just take the bones of the dead and use them for a pillow. And he would be surrounded, I guess, by these cremation mounds where there would be so many remains of the dead. Quite frightening for somebody whose mind is undeveloped. And then the cow herd boys would come up. I guess during the day they would see him and come up, and he must have looked awful, not like the glorious Buddha with lights flashing and shining out from him. But he would have been thin, either naked or wearing a hempen robe, probably a long growth of beard and hair. Very ascetic expression on the face. And there must have been rough boys who didn't have any faith in ascetics and religious people, and they would come up to him, and this is terrible, and spit on him and urinate on him and throw dirt at him. And they would poke sticks in his ears. And yet he says that he never aroused a mind of hatred or anger against them. This was his perfection of equanimity, of upekkha. Okay, now he describes some of his other practices with regard to food. Okay, now there are some of these views that were commonly held amongst the ascetics and Brahmins of that period, maybe even today, that, there are even today. Purification comes about through food. You eat special diet and you get purified. Yeah, there is such a view. I remember even in Sri Lanka, they came to the forest hermitage where I was staying, a Ukrainian, partly of Polish descent, who had been ordained as a Hindu Swami in India, and his idea was that one should eat only raw foods, and this will purify one, so that one, with the purified body, one will become enlightened. So this is a kind of purification through food. But the view of this period was one should just eat only special types of food. So some say there's a type of fruit in that period called the cola fruit. I don't know exactly what it is. So they eat only the cola fruits and drink cola fruit powder. They drink cola fruit juice, eat cola fruit powder. They make cola fruit concoctions. I'm sure you could see this on television and sell it across on television. And so the Buddha, he must have seen one of these advertisements on the television of that period and thought, let me try that. And so he was eating only cola fruits, drinking only cola juice, and taking only one cola fruit a day till his body became extremely emaciated. So he says that because I ate so little, the projections on my spine stood forth like corded beads. We could say like the beads on a mala, the rosary. And my ribs jutted out like the rafters of an old roofless barn. And then the gleam of my eyes sank far down in their sockets, like the water far down in a deep well. Then my belly skin, the skin of my belly, actually stuck to my backbone, so that if I wanted to touch my belly skin, I could actually feel my backbone. And if I wanted to touch my backbone, I could feel my belly skin. Maybe some of you have seen that there's some famous statues from the Gandhara period of Buddhist art. This is the Buddhist art, the first period of Buddhist art, which was actually came through the Greek influence in the area of Gandhara, which is present-day Afghanistan and Pakistan. And there's a famous statue, or probably several statues, which show the Bodhisattva when he was practicing austerities, and you see him so thin that there's almost nothing left to his body but skin and bones. And the face is so shriveled up that he looks like an old man of about 90 years old. Have you seen these statues? There was one in Kailania Temple when we went to Sri Lanka last year. I think that one was the famous one from Pakistan that Pakistan had sent to Sri Lanka for exhibition. And then there was a famous incident that took place when the Bodhisattva, one time when he wanted to defecate, he fell over on the ground, and some of the devas who were watching him thought, maybe he's dead. But those who had faith thought, no, he's not dead, but he's just fainted. Okay, then in the next paragraphs, he just continues explaining how he continued with this experiment with food, reducing his diet with other types of food. And in each case, he found that these practices only kept his body in the state of extreme emaciation, but didn't bring him any wisdom. And so in paragraph 56, he comes to the conclusion. He says, by such conduct, by such practice, by such performance of austerities, I did not attain any superhuman states, any distinction in knowledge and vision worthy of the noble ones. Why was that? Because I did not attain that noble wisdom which, when attained, is noble and emancipating and leads the one who practices in accordance with it to the complete destruction of suffering. So all of these paragraphs that we have just read show how the Buddha is now taking the extreme of self-mortification to its ultimate limit, the extreme of ascetic practice to its ultimate limit, and finds that this practice of self-mortification is painful and ignoble and futile, because it doesn't, and the reason why it's futile, unbeneficial, and worthless is because it doesn't produce wisdom. And at this point, you could link this paragraph here up with Sutta number 36. That's the Mahāsīhanāda Sutta. You could link that paragraph up with the Mahāsīhanāda Sutta, paragraph number 30 on page 340. Here the Buddha says, whatever ascetics or Brahmins in the past have experienced painful, racking, piercing feelings due to their exertion, this is the utmost, there is none beyond this. And the same for the ascetics and Brahmins in the future and at the present. And he says that by this racking practice of austerities, I have not attained any superhuman states, any distinction in knowledge and vision worthy of the noble ones. Then he considers, could there be another path to enlightenment? And then he remembers an incident that took place many years earlier when he was a child, when on one occasion when his father, the Shakyan ruler Suddhodana, was conducting the plowing festival. This was the ritual of plowing the ground at the beginning of the plowing season. His father took him together with the nurses and they put him under a tree, a rose apple tree. And everybody went off to the field to conduct the plowing ritual, and they left the little child alone under the tree. And while he sat there, he just crossed his legs and started to attend to his breathing, just spontaneously. And through attention to the breath, suddenly his mind left the realm of the senses and he entered into this very blissful, very joyful, very tranquil state. And now he recollected that state, that experience, and the question came to his mind, could this be the path to enlightenment? And then, following up on that memory, the realization came to him, this is the path to enlightenment. And then he took up that mode of practice. He entered into he started to take solid food again. He regained his health and his strength. Then he started to practice the jhanas, the meditative absorptions, and then he developed the insights and the wisdom that culminated in his enlightenment and liberation. Okay, here we go back to the Mahāsīhanāda Sutta. here the Buddha, speaking to Sariputta, says that he wants to exhaust all the possibilities. So he says, there are some ascetics and Brahmins who hold that purification comes simply by traveling around in samsara, not making any special effort, but just going on from one life to the next. Then the Buddha says, I've traveled through just about every state of existence in this samsara, except for the devas of the pure abodes. But just by traveling around through this round of rebirths, it's not possible to gain purification. Okay, then in paragraph 60, he says, there are some who hold the view that purification comes through sacrifice, but in my past lives as a noble king or a prosperous Brahmin, I've made many types of sacrifices, but they didn't lead to purification. Then the next paragraph, I've tried many types of fire worship, but they didn't lead to purification. Then paragraph 62, he says that there are some ascetics and Brahmins who hold the view that as long as one is young, strong, and healthy, then one has a perfectly lucid mind and one's wisdom is clear and sharp. But when one grows old, 80, 90, or 100 years old, then one's wisdom starts to fade out, one's mind becomes dull and blunt. But now the Buddha says, I have become old, aged, burdened with years, advanced in life. I've reached my 80th year. And now he uses a comparison. Suppose I had 4 disciples. Each one has a lifespan of 100 years with perfect mindfulness, perfect memory, and completely lucid wisdom. And now suppose these disciples were to continuously ask me about any point of doctrine, about the 4 foundations of mindfulness. And they would not rest or pause except to eat, drink, to go to the bathroom, and so on. Still, the Buddha says, my exposition of the Dhamma, my explanation of these points of doctrine, my replies to their questions would not come to an end, but these 4 disciples of mine could go on asking their questions for a full 100 years, and their lives would come to an end. And this is how clear my wisdom is, even at the end of my lifespan. And then the Buddha ends the discourse by saying that if one were to say of anyone that a being not subject to delusion has appeared in the world for the welfare and happiness of many, out of compassion for the world, for the good welfare and happiness of gods and human, it is of me indeed that, rightly speaking, this should be said. Okay, then when the Buddha finished speaking, there was another monk by the name of Nagasamala standing behind him, fanning him. Then this monk expressed his appreciation of the discourse. He said, "This is wonderful, this is marvelous. And he said, as I listened to this discourse, the hairs of my body stood up. What is the name of this discourse on the Dhamma? And then the Buddha said, for this reason, you may remember this discourse as the hair-raising discourse. That is, Loma Hangsana Pariyayo. And so, at one time, this sutta had been called the hair-raising discourse. But at a certain point, the name got changed to the greater discourse on the lion's roar. I see there's a note to that. Let me see what the note says. 199. Yeah, the sutta is referred to by the name Loma Hangsana Pariyaya in the Questions of King Milinda, the Milinda Panha, and in the commentary to the Digha Nikaya. Okay, if there's any questions then on anything in this discourse, not only what I spoke this evening, but anything covered earlier.
Why was the word supreme used for the coarseness and the scrupulousness rather than extreme?
I guess the word supreme, parama is the Pali word, is used because the Buddha wants to show that he's carried this particular type of practice further than anybody else. I think that's the intent. If he just says extreme, I mean, it is extreme, but it doesn't indicate that he's carried that practice further than the others who have undertaken that type of practice. Yes?
How about bathing in water 3 times daily? Why would that be a hardship?
Actually, I have to say, it doesn't seem particularly like a hardship to me. I have to say the way it's translated doesn't make it sound like particularly like a hardship. But there might be something connected with that practice that if we understood the details of it, that would make it seem like some kind of austerity. But it's not, I have to say, it's not immediately clear to me why it's an austerity.
It does mention in the evening, so maybe if it were cool outside, it might be unpleasant to bathe.
Unless it's really the cold season, it wouldn't be so unpleasant. Many people during the other seasons go bathing in the evening. It could be something like subjecting one's body, like standing under a waterfall for a long period to subject one's body to the force of the waterfall. It's a guess. Yes, Joanna. The emaciated, I can't hear the question. So.
I'm trying to understand the relationship between the emaciated image of Buddha.
Yeah. Yeah. And the full figure. Okay, what is the relationship between the figure of the emaciated Buddha and the figure of the full-bodied Buddha? I'm not really in any way very knowledgeable about Gandhara art. My guess is that probably the full-bodied figure of the Buddha would have evolved first. This is my guess, because the artist would have wanted to represent the Buddha in his status as an enlightened one. before, they would represent him in the earlier stage of his career as an ascetic practicing on the way to enlightenment.
The Buddha is saying in this sutta that it is as much a hindrance to gaining wisdom.
No, I didn't finish answering her question.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, I was still in the process. No.
My apologies.
Okay, so my guess is that the full figure of the Buddha would have come first, and then at a certain point, perhaps the Gandharan artists would have been somehow taken up by the story of the bodhisattvas striving for enlightenment, and that motivated them, inspired them to create this figure of the emaciated Buddha. That is just my guess. But if you're interested, there should be books on early Buddhist art, but maybe an understanding of the temporal relationship of the two, maybe there is none. Okay, now your question.
Is the message from this sutta that is almost as bad to give in to complete self-deprivation in terms of gaining wisdom as it would be to give in to hedonistic desire?
Okay, is the message that it's almost as bad to practice extreme asceticism as it is to give in to hedonistic desires? Well, in the Buddha's first discourse, that's to the 5 monks at Benares, that's setting in motion the wheel of the Dhamma, the Buddha describes both self-indulgence, the indulgence in sense pleasures, and self-mortification as two extremes to be avoided by a practitioner who should take the Majjhima Patipada, the middle way. But he describes the two extremes differently. He describes the extreme of sensual indulgence. He says it's something that's common, worldly, ignoble, and unbeneficial. Common, worldly, indulged in by worldly people, ignoble, not noble, and unbeneficial. When he describes the extreme of asceticism or extreme of self-mortification, he describes it simply as painful, ignoble, and unbeneficial. So he doesn't describe it as common, worldly, or something engaged in by worldly people. But a practitioner has to avoid both these extremes. But the extreme of asceticism is usually resorted to by those who are seeking enlightenment, seeking liberation. So they're in some way drawn towards the goal, but they're just taking the wrong path. Yes?
I'm just thinking about the difference in the Bodhisattva conception. Am I right, in the Mahāyāna tradition, would the Bodhisattva be a realized enlightened being?
In the Mahāyāna conception, the Bodhisattva is conceived as being at different stages. So the Bodhisattva conception in Mahāyāna developed over a long period out of the early conception of the Bodhisattva. But here in the very early text, the Buddha uses the word Bodhisattva to refer to himself in the early period of his life before his enlightenment. Any further questions? Okay, so this will be the end of our spring semester. So we'll have a new semester in the fall, in September. please remember to register for the summer school, the summer Dharma retreat, if you haven't done so already. Okay, so we end with the sharing of the merits. Okay, so we share the merits with the devas, the spirits, the other beings, asking them to rejoice in these merits, to protect the Buddha's teachings in the world, and to protect the beings of the world. Akasata chabhumata deva naga mahidika punyantang anumoditva chirang rakantu sasanang. Akasata chabhumata deva naga mahidika punyantang anumoditva chirang rakantu desanam. Akasata chabhumata deva naga mahidika punyantang anumoditva chirang rakantu mang parang. Etavata cha amhehi sampadang punya sampadang sabbe deva anumodantu sabba sampati siddhya. Etavata cha amhehi sampadang punya sampadang sabbe bhutta anumodantu sabba sampati siddhya.